Good evening. Welcome back to the John A. and Carol O. Moran Lecture Hall at the Community Library for tonight's program with our... What's that?
We got juice PowerPoint.
Okay, sorry. Brad has things to do. Sorry.
Forgot to do this.
Sorry.
Okay, now you're ready.
Okay. Good evening. And welcome back to the John A. and Carol O. Moran Lecture Hall at the Community Library for tonight's program with our beloved local journalist, author, Tony Evans, who I should also note is the creative writing teacher in the winter here at the library. So don't forget to sign up. Tony's talk, and of course his 2017 book, A History of Indians in the Sun Valley Area, is very timely for us, particularly given that our very own Regional History Museum has recently opened a new exhibition titled Who Writes History? Frontier Voices, Native Realities. Our hope is that this exhibition will prompt some needed discussion and understanding around that very question. Who gets the right history? And while I think we all know the answer to that question, at least in our post-colonial world, and probably for the most part understand its implications on ideology and policy and culture and society as a whole, I wonder how many of us have really considered it on a local level. I, for one, have admittedly fallen into the ethnocentric trap of seeing our valley as the Sun Valley story. And while I've always known that there were people here before the resort, and even before the first mining claim, the details in the stories have somewhat escaped me. Where are those voices? Who among us has the courage and the resilience to share them and to do so with reverence and honor? I have to say that I am thankful that Tony has taken this task on for us, providing voice and context for a history and culture that is too easily forgotten, that of Indians in the Sun Valley area. I should also note that the library will also be hosting Shoshone Nation Chairman Darren Perry on May 14th to help us better understand the Bear River Massacre in southeastern Idaho. And then on May 15th, a special screening of the film In Good Faith, a video documentary focusing on the Virginia City Treaty of 1868 and in 1905, the U.S. rescindment of that reservation, prompting the mixed band's 200-mile removal south to the Fort Hall Indian Reservation. So don't miss those as well. In helping us to kick off this month of important reflection and conversation, thank you, Tony, for your efforts and for being here with us tonight to educate us, to bring voice to an amazing people, and reminding us of a rich, yet also sometimes painful history. Of course, we also thank you for your efforts day in and day out in sharing your continued passion for storytelling with us here at the library and in the wider community. Tony.
Thanks, Tim. What a wonderful introduction. Excuse me? Oh, how about this? Can people hear me in the back? I can speak up a little if you need to. All right. Excuse me? Oh, how's about that? Honey, hey, hey, honey, hey, oh, we hey. I wasn't going to do that, but it is a mic check. It's a good mic check. Cleared my throat a little bit. That's a Mohawk social dance song. That's a rabbit dance song. If you're in Iroquois country and you go to a gathering, you're very likely to hear a rabbit dance song. So I'm a native guy, but I'm way off reservation out here out west. We're Iroquois. We're Ganyankahaga. We're from the East Coast. I have taken an interest in local and regional Native history because it's been a lifelong passion for me to explore Native cultures and Native histories. In some ways, I'm getting to know the Western tribes in Idaho better than I know my own in the last couple of years because of another project. Excuse me?
Could you pronounce your full name?
My full name is Tekaroniake, and this name means two skies in the Mohawk language in Ganyankahaga. This is a name given to me by my great-grandfather, Joseph Tekaroniake Lefebvre. There's a lot of twos in Mohawk country. There's two rivers, two axes. My Uncle Ed is two axe. I'm two skies. I don't know why this is there. Thanks. Anyway, we're going to get started. So first of all, thank you to the library for being such a fantastic institution. When I was working on this book and trying to finish it with my editor, my long-suffering partner in this book, and I just want to point him out right now. His name's Mike Healy. He's a retired high school teacher, and he's sitting in the back. Mike Healy took on this project, I don't know, 3 years ago, thinking we both thought, oh, we'll knock this out in 3 months. And I believe it was 2 years later when we finally felt like it was ready for prime time. But while I was during this period and after I wrote the initial newspaper articles about the book, there was a period of time when I don't know, I was feeling doubtful that a project with such a local and specific significance would have much of an appeal. And about this time, the library hosted a talk by a woman named Elizabeth Fenn. And Elizabeth Fenn went to the University of Colorado, where I also went to school. She won a Pulitzer Prize in history for writing about the Mandan people, who, it's a fascinating story. I interviewed her for the newspaper, and I told her I was working on something, and she was very encouraging when she heard that I was doing a local Native history. She said, Tony, you shouldn't be discouraged. She said, Native history is American history. There's no separation between the two. And I have always separated them in my mind. I have always thought that there's a certain Native component to American history that gets relegated to anthropology or somehow doesn't matter as much. And so the library brings people to town here who are extraordinary and inspiring. And the fact that they're collaborating with the Sun Valley Center right now on all of these Native-themed events is really well worth celebrating. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about my book, and I'll get into some of the inspirations that I had for writing it a few slides down. But first I want to tell you a personal story to get started. I was raised off the reservation, as the majority of Native Americans, enrolled Indians in America and Canada live off the reservation. Cities like Minneapolis, and in our case, Brooklyn, New York, are very, very much populated by Native people. I was born in Brooklyn and raised in various places. My mother chose to live everywhere but the reservation when we were kids, which was a little bit of a frustration for me because I was always intrigued by my heritage, and I've as I grew up, I managed to spend more and more time there. But I was living in rural Georgia, in the Deep South, when I entered grade school. And the Deep South is where, you may recall, the Trail of Tears rounded up dozens of nations and marched them to the frontier, which at the time was Oklahoma. And so many tribes that were in the area where I was living, the Creeks, the Uchis, the Coyotes, obscure named tribes that I was always intrigued by, they were gone. And so I was studying the first Thanksgiving in my third grade classroom, and my dear teacher was showing us pictures of the Pilgrims who came to Plymouth Rock, named after the automobiles, I figured. And these Pilgrims had great big black hats, and they had silver buckles on their shoes. And they were really important people. And when they got here, they had a big dinner. They had a big Thanksgiving dinner with the Indians. And I'm thinking, this is getting good, and eventually something came up in our workbook, and there was a picture of an Indian, not only an Indian, but a guy who looked pretty Mohawk to me. He had like a scalp lock and, the side of his head shaved. And, kids love Indians, right? I don't know why that is. Kids love everything that's magical or intriguing or mysterious. So the kids in the class started saying, wow, Indians, look at the Indians. Let's go see Indians. Where are the Indians? And I raised my hand up in the back of the class, and I said, I'm Indian. And the group of kids turned around and looked at me, and the teacher, her eyes rolled. And she said, "Tony, stop telling stories. We all know that Indians used to be here, but that Indians are no longer around, that Indians are gone." And I said, "Well, where did they go?" I mean, I'd heard my grandmother speak Mohawk in my house. You know, we've got Indian stuff, you know. I'm going to the reservation any day now. And she said, well, the Indians melted into a melting pot of Americans. They used to live in teepees, they used to shoot bow and arrows, but they're really no longer around. Well, I just turned red. I was such a shy kid, I probably nearly passed out in the class, and I couldn't wait to get home. And the first thing I said to my mom, "Mom, are you sure we're Indian?" I just heard that we went extinct, like the woolly mammoths, like the dinosaurs. And now, this began a conversation with my mother and my grandmother. And I'm pretty sure my mother met with my teacher, and I was not present for that teaching moment. That when my mother arrived at the elementary school, to set the record straight. But my dear teacher, I loved her, and I can understand why she believed that, because there was a policy that in 1970 that, you know, we were getting to the end of an age of assimilation, the beginnings of the Native Rights Movement, you know, and when the American Indian people took Alcatraz and started saying, "Hey, we're here," you know. But this was the rural South, and I, of course, could understand why even an accredited teacher in a grade school would believe what she was telling me. Now, I tell this story because one of the great satisfactions of having finished this book, finally, with Mike Healy, and having an introduction written by a retired chairman of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, Lionel Boyer, who you'll meet in a minute in my slideshow, is that the school district here in Blaine County purchased 200 or 300 copies of my book to teach in the 3rd and 4th grade. So that mistake won't happen again. At least not here. Okay, when I launched this book a year or two ago, young Chief Washakie showed up. Now this is a fella. He was about 18 years old at the time. He's descended from Chief Washakie of the Shoshone, who is a legendary chief in the tribe who met with the Mormons, and he met with the U.S. government, and he was one of those very big, influential chiefs. And young Chief came with his parents and his grandparents to honor me for coming out with this book. He also, there's a picture of him on the cover that was taken in Fairfield, Idaho, Camas Lily days, which I'll also discuss coming up. This my mother, that's my dear mom on the left there, Tekaroniake Evans, in case you haven't met her. She's been around town longer than me. And Evelyn Phillips on the right, who did our production and maps and extraordinary layout for the book. Young Chief's parents are sheep-eater Indians. They were, I'm sorry, they're not Agadika, they're Tukutika tribes. And I am still just learning some of the intricacies of the native communities and their names and histories here. His grandparents came. His mother works at Indian Health Service in Fort Hall Reservation, and his father lives at the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, where his ancestor, Chief Washakie, lived. Anybody recognize this location?
Sun Valley, the meadow.
Yes, that's Sun Valley Road. This is Dollar Mountain. This kind of thing was taking place where we think it's the 4th of July parade or maybe a rodeo. Ralph Harris might be able to straighten me out on that because he's a long-time local guy. But for the first time in living memory, a group of native people came to the area where this picture was taken. We set up, I worked helping set up teepees with them last summer, and they had a mini powwow in this site. And that is thanks to some individuals who I want to mention right now who happen to be with us today. It's Tom Cray and Ralph Harris. Would you two guys stand up for a second so we could recognize you? Thank you. Now, these two men have become good friends over the years in various ways. I'm sure a lot of you know them. But they made friends with somebody at Camas in Fairfield because they're all horsemen together. And they invited this gentleman to town. His name's Leo Arrowhite. And Leo Arrowhite is going to be giving a talk on April 25th as part of the Sun Valley Center for the Arts. And there's a scholar coming to talk about the Shoshone-Bannock too. But it's because of friendships like that that a lot of cultural exchange takes place and a lot of education opportunities for all of us. So thank you. I still want to find out who this man is riding this horse with a travaux and pulling a grandchild here. If you look, If you look into the picture deep in the back there, you can see somebody with a full-blown war bonnet on. A lot like Young Chief Washaki's, which is like a 125-year-old war bonnet made by the medicine man for Chief Washaki. This kind of regalia, these kinds of family heirlooms and tribal artifacts are an extraordinary means for ceremony. I've learned, especially out west, the context really for material culture is ceremony and the way things are used in ceremony. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward with the story here. Okay, so every book starts with an inspiration, right? I think 25, 30 years ago, I was driving across Galena Summit, and I came upon this sign telling me that Alexander Ross, who I would learn later is a Scottish school teacher who turned into fur trapping because he needed some adventure and he went out west, working for Hudson's Bay Company and others, that he came up the Wood River Valley and discovered this summit in September 18th, 1824. Now that word discovered is not an accident, nor is it a joke. And what I've come to find out, and I learned this in college, but I've come to reacquaint myself with something called the doctrine of discovery. And it began in 1493 when the Spanish Catholic Church and the Spanish Crown, which were perhaps, I believe, one and the same as a governmental entity, the New World had been discovered. The Pope at the time decreed that any lands discovered in this vast new world that's been found that is not inhabited by Christian people can be taken, claimed, and owned by the Spanish Crown. And the doctrine of discovery has been adopted by courts in the United States for generations, hundreds of years. It is still challenged to this day by native groups. You know, Indians are lawyered up these days, and we're going after land rights and all kinds of things. And this doctrine of discovery, even when I was in college, people were saying, "What the heck?" Alexander Ross was, trying to make a living getting beaver skins because they're waterproof skins for hats. It was a big deal in Europe. And I don't know that they made any kind of specific land claim when they first came into the valley. But Alexander, I looked him up in my book. I said, I want to write this book. I'd had an assignment from the newspaper to write the stories. I found, Google is so amazing. I found on the digital archive a memoir that this guy wrote in about 1870 about his time as a young man coming up the Wood River Valley. And he had this impression when he reached Galena Summit with this big contingent of quasi-military fur trap. There were Iroquois people along too, because the Iroquois that were contacted 200 years earlier were very good beaver trappers and scouts and translators. He said in his memoirs, I looked out over the Sawtooth Basin and thought I must be the first human being to ever lay eyes on this place. And then he looked down at his horse and he saw a grouse with an arrow stuck in it. And the bird was still alive, kicking around at his feet. And then he realized, and it's a funny moment in the book where he became disillusioned and remembered, oh, there's people here. And they're probably watching me right now, which probably turned out to be the case. And it's a bit of speculation on my part, but I have a feeling that these could have been the Tukudeka or Tukudeka people, the sheep-eater Indians who lived high in the mountains, never adopted the horse, and lived on white pine nuts and various things, and a very intriguing group for mountain people like us who happen to live here.
They had dogs too.
They did. They have dogs. They use dogs as pack animals. And some of these questions, if you want further information, I'll answer what I can afterwards. But there are some authorities with much deeper knowledge on these topics who are coming to town. And Tim was kind enough to mention them. They're coming. I would say Leo Arrowhite's going to come to town on April 25th. I wouldn't miss that. He's going to be able to answer a lot of questions. I've learned a lot from him in the last year since meeting him. And I have a degree in anthropology. I think I'm all smart. And, you know, the archaeologists miss a lot. I mean, I'll have an example soon. Anyway, this was the inspiration for the book because I kind of wanted to set the record straight. And I kind of wanted to point out that Alexander didn't discover anything. He was following directions the whole way and well-worn track. We found a mining claims map. This is hand-drawn Rand McNally map. You can find copies of it at the Blaine County Historical Museum, which is my nonprofit sponsor in the publication of this book. There are trails called out on this map, and we put them in red in the book. Here's one right here. It says Old Indian Trail. There's another one down here. This one comes down out of the Boulder Mountains, and it intersects with the Bigwood River at North Fork. So right here where my light is the SNRA Visitor Center. And I've had some fun hiking out there and trying to figure out where that topo is. I think it goes up to, it might be Castle Peak. Does anyone happen to know? Anyway, there's another old Indian trail called out down here that comes down Trail Creek Road and lands in Ketchum. This is the old Indian trail that Alexander Ross took when he came from the Chalice area originally. There's another one down here that empties out into Bellevue. This is Muldoon Canyon. It's called the Old Lemhi Trail. I called to the Fort Hall Culture and Language Department years ago to ask them if they knew about any more trails. And Velda Racehorse, who was in charge of the committee at the time, she said, oh yeah, have you heard of Highway 75? Now, Alexander Ross, when he was standing up on Galena Summit, would have been looking over this vast, pristine valley that we all know because we live here. And it is a breathtaking thing to get up to Galena Summit. One of the things his eyes would have passed over far in the distance was this is the redfish overhang. It's well known to archaeologists. It's I think still kind of obscure to tourists. It exists at the outlet of Redfish Lake, not a stone's throw from a campground across a bridge. I went there with my wife on the day before the big solar eclipse a couple of years ago, just by chance. I wasn't doing some new age, solar visitation thing, but I did want to, pull in and stop by, and it's a remarkable spot. I stood there and just was trying to get my head around 10,000 years of time, because this was inhabited at various periods from 10,000 years ago. And I was just probably standing there just, I can go back hundreds of years, even a couple of thousand, and then, I just intuitively, I can't quite grasp it. And I'm sitting there in a weird spell, and I'm sure Lauren's looking at me like, what's wrong with you? And about this time, a couple of guys come down the hill from behind the redfish overhang. And they turn out to be two anthropologists. And one of them's a non-Indian guy from back east. The other guy is about 6'4", a big, tall guy from Fort Hall Reservation, who his name turns out to be Timothy Wildcat Haskett. Now, we have a little chat outside the Redfish Overhang. They tell us that the petroglyphs inside have been vandalized, and so they're basically standing guard because these are sacred sites. They're still used ceremonially under the radar. There are hundreds, thousands of sites like this around the West. And I talked to Haskett, and I said, I know that name, I know that word. I mean, Haskett, is that the same name for the tool points? The archaeological description of the Haskett tool points, they're narrowish spear points that were very specific to this area, to a certain period in time, thousands of years ago, I believe. And it turns out, the guy says, yeah, that's named after my grandfather. Well, I called Babette Haskett, who's gotten to be a friend of mine. She works at Fort Hall in the Language and Culture Department today, and I've been working on some projects with her. And I said, what's the connection between your family? And she said, well, you know, the grandfather, Parley Haskett, was a arrowhead hunter. He was a great fiddler, too. And eventually the archaeologists needed to name this after something. And so we named it after Parley Haskett. Not an Indian guy, but a guy who married an Indian. And then, you know, this fella, Timothy Wildcat, who I met, is the grandson of Parley Haskett. Keeping an eye on Redfish Overhang. And Timothy Wildcat is a student in anthropology at Idaho State University. So here's a picture taken by Eugene Ants. He was a prolific photographer during the late 1800s, early 20th century. Eugene took this picture at Fort Hall, we believe. I've come to learn that there is a sort of signifier, I think, in dress at certain periods when tribes were being contacted by missionaries, say. And, you know, a lot of Indians would still wear cloaks and robes and blankets. And I've learned in a project I'm working on with the Nez Perce, related to the Nez Perce, and the Coeur d'Alene tribes in northern Idaho, that when people are still in the robe, it's called, you know, in the robe, means they still tend to be holding on to their traditions. And I saw this picture, and you'll see there's kind of a, you know, a mix of dress here, and you know, it could just mean it was a cold day, I don't know. But the idea that I'm gathering is that some people would move to Western dress when they adopted Western religion and Western traditions. Now, about this time, there was some trouble on the prairie, the Camas Prairie. This is a location, 35 miles, maybe a little more. Fairfield, Idaho, Camas Prairie. This was a place where the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, the Paiutes, I believe many other tribes, this would be a question for Leo, gathered here to gather camas bulbs in the summer. This is how Camas Prairie is going to look in about a month when the camas bulbs bloom. Camas has to be prepared in a certain way, and Lewis and Clark didn't know this when they were traveling across the Lolo Trail. They ended up landing in Nez Perce country at Kamei in about 1806, I believe. And they were nearly starving crossing this mountain desert. And there were very many areas where this stuff was growing, but they didn't know how to eat it. They tried eating it and got quite sick. When you roast camas bulbs, like they do at Camas Lily Days in Fairfield occasionally when they have their spring celebrations, it tastes like sweet potatoes, and it dries and it keeps very well, and it's a reliable, starchy food item for tribes all over Idaho. It's also the scene of a conflict that broke out after the Fort Hall Reservation was established. And a certain amount of meals and provisions were guaranteed to the people who went to Fort Hall and were reduced from their huge ranges to this tiny area and taught how to farm. But as happened in many cases around the West following the Civil War, these provisions were promised as part of the treaty agreements, but never delivered. And people were starving on Fort Hall. So certain individuals took it upon themselves to go to Cam's Prairie and also to try to regain a little sense of dignity. And wars broke out. And this was at a time when the American Army had very little tolerance for Indian insurrections. This is Chief Buffalo Horn, a Bannock chief. The Bannock War raged for months one summer. A great many tribes got involved in it. After it ended, and it was a bloody conflict, it ranged clear to, I believe, the border of Oregon, Bonner's Ferry. There were raids, there were atrocities, there were battles. When it was all over, and I don't believe these people ever really thought they had a chance, the war against Chief Joseph had taken place only a year earlier in 1877 in northern Idaho. And in that case, the Nez Perce, traveling with their grandparents, children, grandchildren, trying to outrun an army with artillery, didn't make it to the Canadian border. But General Crook said something. I put this in my book because General Crook was a kind of a noted Indian fighter himself. And he found it in his heart to write this about the policy. He said, our Indian policy has resolved itself into a question of warpath or starvation. And being merely human, many of them, the Indians, will always choose the former alternative when death will at least be glorious. Now, when the war ended, there was a period of time, even before the war, when Native people could be hunted and killed for being Indian in the wrong place out west. So I've learned this by talking to some people at the Duck Valley Reservation. And I was not exactly clear on whether to include this in the book because our book is for the traveling public. It's for kids. It's for school children. And, but I asked a friend from Duck Valley who is related to John Trudell, someone I knew years ago, his niece actually, Sarah Manning. I said, you know, your father, Sarah, has told me that, you know, there were scalps. There were ransoms on Paiute scalps, man, woman, and child. There were ads in the newspaper saying we will pay you $5 in silver for every child Paiute scalp. And this is in the cover of the Owyhee Avalanche newspaper. I've seen this newspaper article. They would even bank you with a horse and a saddle in case you wanted to get into this business. And so that's during this period and for a good while after, I think it's understandable that Native people didn't frequent the Wood River Valley, didn't leave the reservation perhaps for a good long while. Of course, that's changing. Oh, I asked Sarah Manning, should we have this in a book for kids? She said, well, you know what? I just took a trip to Germany to go study the Holocaust on a fellowship. They know I'm a Native person there, and she was asking the same question. She said, you know, she's a writer actually for Indian Country Today. And she said, I asked this group of women who are men and women teachers who grew up in Germany, and of course they had a horrible Holocaust, and it's taught in the schools. I said, well, yeah, but how young do you teach this? And she held her hand out, about that big. Kids can handle it. They can handle the truth. This is a picture we found here at the Regional History Museum down in the basement of the community library. Fantastic resource. I used not the museum, I'm sorry, the Regional History Library. There are oral histories down there. There are photographs. when I was working on the final draft of the book, we were really eager to get these pictures, but they hadn't been cataloged yet. These are young people that were likely, possibly camped at Hot Porter Park in Haley, because that was an Indian camp. I learned this through one of my interviews with D.A. Utz, a retired teacher who's well into her 90s now. When I looked out of my office window up at the sky, wondering what I was trying to write a caption for the story or something. I looked up at these hills right here, and this is exactly what I see from my living room window. And so I know that I'm quite sure that this is either Bullion Street or Galena Street or one of those right next to where I live. And time collapsed in on itself, because I'm sitting there writing this book. I think these are probably teenagers with some little kids, tromping off, early 1900s, Haley, Idaho, heading over to perhaps the Haley Butcher. There's some rodeo posters here. This is Haley Tourist Park. It's been revamped, the entrance arch. It was called Hot Porter Park for a good long while, and named after Blaine Porter's father, in case you happen to know Blaine, in the city of Haley. And D.A. Utz said that when she was a kid, she would go down to Hot Porter Park because that was where the Indians camped out in the summertime. And so I asked her to tell me that story. And she said, well, they were drying their fish, and then, they had skins from the deer that they'd been hunting that fall or the year before. And she traded an old goat skin that was nailed to her woodshed and hard as a rock for some Indian skin, some deer skin gloves, because the Shoshone Bannock people were known for their tanning skills. And I know very little about this, but I did, when Leo came to Wagon Days last summer, he brought a pair of these gloves for my friend Ralph Harris, I believe, or maybe it was Tom. Tom got the gloves. Oh, you got the good gloves. And you smell these gloves, and they smell smoky, don't they? And they're very, very soft, beautiful deer hide. You can buy them in Fort Hall, but I don't think everybody puts the kind of work into them that they used to have. Another technology that the mountain Shoshone were very well known for is building bows for buffalo hunting. And these bows were made of bighorn sheep horns. I've seen pictures and recreations of them, and they're in museums here and there. And these bows are extraordinarily powerful. You had to really shoot an arrow hard to pierce a buffalo. And people would ride out, I understand, for sometimes 2 or 3 years at a time on a buffalo hunt. They would spend years away. It was a cultural exchange. They would, when the leaves turn a certain color, people know it was time to go. And it was a coming of age thing for young men, a very often violent and dangerous activity to go buffalo hunting. But these bows were made by the Tukadeka people in the mountains and sold at places like Kem's Prairie. This is something I want to do a little more research on and find out from Leo if they have some oral traditions about this. These are not Indians. They look like Indians, yep. I almost fell for it. I found this picture in the basement, and I wanted to use it in the book so bad. I thought, when were Indians on Main Street in Haley in Ketchum, and what does that look like, 1950 maybe, 50s? And I talked to Jim Phillips, an attorney for the newspaper where I work, and I mentioned the name of this fellow writing in the lead here. And he said, that guy, he's a Boise attorney. They dressed up. They had like, Indian makeup, and it's an extraordinary recreation, I would think, of, this might even be eagle feathers, probably before they outlawed non-Indians having eagle feathers. But anyway, I keep this slide in my presentation for this reason. It's fun to dress up. It's fun to use costume, and it's a wonderful thing to do, especially when we're kids. But there's something to know, I believe, when we get older is that there are certain native people who would take offense to this. I'm not one of them who gets offended very easily and is some, a radical activist. My Aunt Nadine now, you would not want to wear some feathers around her. But the fact is, when the United States government enforced its assimilationist policies at various times in American history, Indian people were forbidden for religious practices, for at times dressing the way they wanted to. Hair was cut at certain schools, compulsory education at residential schools. The design was to break up a culture, to separate families, and a big part of that was the suppression of the expression of culture. And when you dress up like an Indian around native people whose grandparents might remember when it was illegal for them to do the same thing, you run into feelings. And I just mention this because I think it's an opportunity to point out there's a lot of talk about cultural appropriation and everything like this, but I think a lot of people don't remember, and I'm only relearning it myself, is that when people were doing this, there were medicine men going to jail for living an authentic native existence and practicing their own religions, okay? So that's why there's some sensitivity there and something to learn from. On the other hand, this is last summer, the Wagon Days Festival that took place in Festival Meadows in Sun Valley. This is a bareback horse racer. If you ever have a chance to go to the Shoshone Bannock Summer Powwow and Festival, and there's a bunch of others, rodeos and things like this, you'll see hundreds of teepees there, and you'll see bareback racers at a full gallop around an eighth of a mile track. And the horse barely slows down when the rider jumps off and another one jumps on the back. It's a relay. And it's an extraordinary thing to watch. And here's a guy from Fort Hall, a native person, dressed like a native person.
Was that race in Fort Hall?
Excuse me?
Was that race in Fort Hall?
They do have races in Fort Hall. They have races all over the country like that, yeah. Also, during Wagon Days, there was a powwow, the one I described. And this is a sort of mini powwow, exhibition powwow. People came from Fort Hall, a lot of men, women, young people. The Ghost Drum Group here played and sang. I wrote articles about it for the newspaper. I played a small role in helping to facilitate the event. I helped Leo put up the teepees, which was really fun. And while we're putting up the teepees, I told him I have a degree in anthropology and, got a book out about, natives in Sun Valley and all that. And he said, archaeologists don't always get it right, Tony. I think he'd already read my book. And he said, I heard about this tool-making site over in Sun Valley. And I said, oh, yeah, 1972, archaeologists discover it. Johns Manville Corporation starts developing it with Sun Valley Company. They did a quick and dirty archaeological survey. They brought all of these artifacts to the museum. And he said, yeah, but why do anthropologists always think it's a tool-making site when they find piles of tools? I said, well, the tools were made there for 7,000 years. They've excavated them. They've got different layers. He said, it's not a tool-making site. It's a lookout. I said, what? He said, this is a place where young men would be posted to just go. It's a strategic point high on a hill. You ever wonder why 7,000 years of piles of chipped stone would be all piled in one spot? It's not because they went up there to make their tools. they're sitting up there for days on end with nothing to do, and of course they're going to make tools. He said also they would make arrowheads, and the small, fine, perfect arrowhead was like the Holy Grail. And because if you make a perfect arrowhead, it's hard, very hard technology to master. These become a form of currency. They're worth a lot. And so what else are these guys going to do up there but chip away and try and make the master arrowhead piece of wood? There's a lot that I have to learn about the native people out here. This is Leo. This is Judge Leo Arrowhite, Fort Hall Reservation. The group of Shoshone and Bannock people who came out here and rode on their horses and drummed and danced and gave prayer. They won the blue ribbon that Leo is holding there for the most inspirational float in the Wagon Days Parade 2018. Now, I mentioned this site in 1972 that was discovered in Sun Valley. And there is a condominium complex there now. It was built many years ago called Indian Springs Condos. There's no signage there, just like there's no signage on the Indian trails that come in and out of the valley. It's something I'd like to work toward. Taking suggestions. We'll perhaps work with the Forest Service, but this would be something that Fort Hall or another group would have to come together about. But I think it would be interesting to have some identifications. I'm working on a podcast, a travel podcast that will do this without sticking any signs in the ground. And there's an outfit out of Jackson, Wyoming that we're trying to fund this travel podcast that'll probably suffice. And I'm going to be working with Fort Hall to make sure I have all my facts straight before we do that. But this is James Osborne, who after the excavation took place and before construction began, he came from Fort Hall and did some ceremony there and told some stories. And I write a little bit about this in my book. There's a 7,000-year layering of native artifacts in this spot. And right until the time that Alexander Ross came into the valley, this spot was in use. And not just this spot, of course, probably the entire areas in the Wood River Valley. I was told by Vilda Racehorse that burials would have been a very casual affair where people, bodies would have been brought up to the cliffs and they would have pulled down stone over the bodies. And, well, a few more things that Leo will have to share with you. Funny things. This is Ramona Willema on the right. She was a Bannock native speaker, very few, only a few hundred people who still speak the native Bannock language. I met her 20 years ago when I went to a powwow in Fort Hall with my brother to see about, somebody here sent me on a mission to see if I could help out with the language support in at Fort Hall. And turned out I think the language got onto Rosetta Stone by now, so you can learn the Bannock language that way. But she's a revered elder there, and she participated in the creation of an exhibit that you can see at the museum, which is owned in partnership with the community library. This is the Ski and Heritage Museum at Forest Service Park. It's a really nice exhibit there. To the left is one of the archaeologists who worked on the excavation. That's Claudia Walsworth. Now, Camas Prairie, what I was talking about a little while ago, was a site of great significance for the Shoshone and Bannock and other tribes. Also the site of the beginning of a bloody conflict. This guy, his name is Wes Fields. He passed away about a year ago. He came to my first book talk, and we managed to have him stand up and honored him in some way. He was from a homesteading family that came in 1904 to Fairfield. They drove their cattle off a train, I believe in Shoshone, and wound up in the Camas Prairie area. They received 160 acres for showing up, basically. The rule was you can homestead if you're white, if you can improve the property, which meant farming so that the federal and state government could get taxes from it, I think, ultimately. But also this was the period of, settling the West. Now, West Fields, even when he was a little kid, he'd see Indians coming through at camas bulb picking time, and they would be driving horse-drawn wagons, which he estimated could have taken about a week to 10 days to get from the Fort Hall Reservation to Fairfield. As he got older, he started seeing them driving by in cars, but they were always keeping a low profile. In about the year 2000, by now, Wes is pushing 90 years old. He said, I want to meet these people. I haven't seen them all my life. I've never even bothered to go down into the swamp and find out what they're doing there. He called it the swamp because there's a wetland. If you go to Centennial Marsh, that is an area that is filled with wildlife, a lot of bird species there. It's an extraordinary wetlands that dries out seasonally. He called it the swamp. And he went down in there and he met some people from Fort Hall. He met Lionel Boyer. He met Lionel Boyer's daughter. He met a handful of kids. And they were picking camas bulbs. They were doing what their treaty provided for, which was access to Camas Prairie. Now, there's a story in my book that is based on a history of Camas, a history, what is that county where Fairfield is? Bend? Camas County is Camas County. Okay, good. The treaty was drawn up. They'd guaranteed the Fort Hall people access to Camas Prairie. C-A-M-A-S. But when the treaty was drawn up, it was spelled Kansas Prairie, K-A-N-S-A-S, which it is widely believed that this was an intentional discrepancy to invalidate the treaty component that guaranteed access to Fort Hall. Now, none other than John Haley, the founding father of the town where I live, Haley, Idaho, saw this happening even during the during the mining era. And he went to Washington, D.C. to make a claim to change the wording because he said these people have been hoodwinked and it's going to lead to trouble. And of course it did. It led to a great deal of trouble. And I believe this is still a big issue for certain people at Fort Hall, no doubt. Anyway, Wes goes down into the swamp. He meets this group of people, and he's really impressed by their friendship. They're doing ceremony there. He had a salmon dinner. They invite him to Fort Hall. He and his wife, Mary Pat, go to Fort Hall. And it was a big eye-opening experience for him. He just never bothered going to a powwow. He'd been living out west all of his life. And they loved teasing each other, This is Lionel Boyer. Lionel called Wes Curly, you can tell, because of his hairdo. And Lionel is a retired chairman of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, Air Force veteran, speaks the language fluently, and knows a whole lot about what goes on. He and Wes conspired to recreate an event that had taken place a generation before in Fairfield called Camas Lily Days, where they celebrate the blooming of the lilies. Only now Camas Lily Days has a native exhibition powwow involved with it. And I broke the story on this return of the Fort Hall native people to Camas Prairie and the new and revised native component to Camas Lily Days. And that was one of the beginnings of my news articles that led to the writing of this book. But again, friendships, right? You have a friendship between Lionel and Curly that led to an event that has outlived Wes now. He died last year. And it's the kind of reconciliation that I was eager to find because I ended my book with this. And here's some young fellows who were fancy dancers at Camas Lily Days. Fancy dancing. Mike Healy knows all about fancy dancing now. I don't know anything about It's a Western tradition, kind of modern, kind of rebellious. It's not traditional dancing. So one of my goals for the book really is to simply add to the historical record around here, to maybe celebrate Native culture in a way that when I was a kid I found it frustrating to find out who the Indians were that were living around me. And the mining industry is celebrated in a big way. Here's a story about the legend of Stanley Basin, 1863. You get a handful of miners who come through and they make a plaque about them, which is fine. The mining industry is central to the history of this area. What I'm trying to do is add to that history. This sign says that the miners discovered gold near this spot, but then they had to remove themselves because roving Indians forced the men to leave without working their discovery. Now, Indians rove because they're subsistence people, and they travel with the game, they travel with the medicines, they travel with the food that they eat. They were seasonal people. This didn't happen to be a farming group of people, the Niue tribes and the Shoshone and the Bannocks. And this next picture is of a roving Indian also. This is my wife. And we rove on mountain bikes now. We were roving through the Stanley Basin some years ago and we found this sign and I took a picture of it. She's Tuscarora. She's also from the Iroquois Confederacy. So that's the end of my talk. If anybody has any questions, I'll do my best.
And I do have a mic, which I'd really appreciate if we were to use.
The picture of the fancy dancers, I was just curious, how long ago was that taken? 2
years ago, I think. And the photographer is Marshall Ralph's son. Jeffrey Ralph, thank you. Yeah.
Tony, has your name changed as you've progressed through life? I know in some groups they will start off with a pet name like Little Prairie Dog and then progress to another name.
Mary, I've been called a lot of names.
Well, I've called you one or two.
You have. But no, my name was given to me at birth, and it was a family name that was passed down, and we do have naming ceremonies. I did not go through that when I was a child.
Do you wear an eagle feather?
No, but I own a few.
Yes.
I was recently given an antique coup stick by someone who needed to get it out of their art collection, basically, and I'm still looking for a home for it. Yeah.
One more question.
Sure.
What's your next book?
My next book is, I'm very happy to say, Washington State University Press is, I've gone through a third round of review with their scholars. They do this anonymous reading of manuscripts. And I worked on a book for 4 years. The working title right now is The Indian Program, The Legacy of Isabel Bond and Upward Bound. And it's about a teacher who worked at the University of Idaho for 45 years, directing the Upward Bound program there, a federal program started by Lyndon Johnson. And it just so happened that the 200-mile radius recruitment area for that university, for that program, happened to intersect with two very large Native reservations, including the Nez Perce. So Isabel, who was a fourth-generation Idahoan, a real legend in the area, as was her mother and grandfather, she made it her goal to bring Native people to the University of Idaho for generations. And I interviewed some of her students who are now on the band council or vice chair people or doctors and lawyers. And so it's a fascinating history of a teacher who happened to work within Native communities. And I think we're going to talk a contract next month with Washington State University. Yeah.
Tony, thank you. It was a marvelous talk. Just a couple things. That first slide was indeed the Sun Valley Rodeo Grounds. Harriman built that in 1938 when they're trying to expand their summer attractions. Beyond another person or another group of people beyond the fence looked like people in Civil War garb. They had, I think, a mini Civil War thing. Got a great write-up in the New York Times before in early summer to get people out here.
Do you know what year that was?
Well, it was built, it opened in 38,
Okay.
and it ran through World War II. My guess is that might be the first one, based on the kind of people in the background
Thank
and
you so
the
much.
Civil War thing.
Thank you so much.
The map you showed was done by William Siemens. He was an early settler of Bellevue, and Siemens Creek is named after him. That's the water supply of Bellevue. And he did that as part of a pamphlet. He was a large landowner in 1880, and he was trying to get people to immigrate to the Wood River Valley in Bellevue so he could sell land. So he did a pamphlet describing the virtues and the wonderful resources of the Wood River Valley in Bellevue, and that map was a part of that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
The other thing
Now it is a Rand. It does say Rand McNally.
They
on
published
the
it, I
map. Was he the They were the publisher, and he provided it.
he wrote it. I don't know how you got a book published. He perhaps sent it in, and they published it. And
Okay.
I don't know if it was ever sold because it was designed to attract people here. The last point, my family's lived here since 1881, and my immediate family moved to Shoshone in the 1890s. And my father and his cousin remember roving bands of Native Americans coming through in the late teens and early 20s. Very common. And they drove buckboards. You know, they didn't have cars in those days, but that was very common, at least in the summertime.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering about, you mentioned the Tekaroniake, is that how you pronounce it?
I think so.
Okay. Have you read Mountain Spirit here at the library?
No.
Oh, there's a whole book about that.
Great. Now you tell me.
We have it right here at the library.
Everything here, yeah, almost.
I did read Tony Taylor's Mountain Sentinels, and Tony Taylor recently passed away, and we had some good talks over the last 6 months or so, and I really liked his book. As a journalist, I am always terrified I'm going to get something wrong, you know, and oftentimes there are conflicting reports about events, and it's tempting for me to go to Google and Wikipedia and find things and then trace the sources down and through that. But I love when I give a talk and people actually provide things that they know, that they've experienced, what a historian, I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist, but what a historian would call a first person primary source material, right? So thanks for straightening me out.
A couple of questions. One of them is, what do you know? Is it the Shoshone-Bannock language? What is it else? Is it linguistically related to other native languages? And which ones?
I learned that there are language groups, linguists, it's called the Niue people, we think. And this extends clear to the West Coast. I think it's a Uto-Aztecan root language. I think, I'm pretty sure that Shoshone and Bannock were quite separate, but then put on the same reservation. The Paiute Indians of Duck Valley, who I've gotten to know a little bit, they speak a very close language to Bannock. So those are very closely linked. The linguists, of course, they trace migrations of people through language stock. And it takes however long, 400, 500 years, or maybe a few generations for a language to branch out when they're separated from one another. But the Niue language groups stretch well into Wyoming, up toward the Canadian, not all the way up to the Columbia River Plateau. That's a different language group up there. But the Uto-Aztecan group is, I think it even includes some of the Southwest tribes. But that's a very good question. I don't really know the answer.
Well, actually, that was a good answer. The second one is how are they doing with kind of reviving the language? Are there immersion schools, or because I know, for example, Hawaii had sort of died out almost in the 70s. They had the a Hawaiian sort of cultural, I won't say revolution, but it was a cultural renaissance. So there are actually a lot of native speakers. Yep. You can go do an ATM and you'll have an option to do the transaction Hawaiian. They call out the streets on the bus in the correct, actually it's a guy from Minnesota who calls out the street names, but it's correct Hawaiian pronunciation. So it's just blossomed. I'm just wondering how they're doing with reintroducing some of these native languages. Because really you lose the knowledge when you lose the language,
right? And
because so much is encoded in the language, and it's really important to preserve those languages.
I agree with you, and I'll just point out that there is an indigenous advisory committee at the United Nations. I have a relative of mine who has been participating from Mohawk country in Geneva for a long, long time, and also in New York. They have established this year, 2019, as the year of indigenous languages. So it's time to start learning your language again. Now, I'm baby steps for me. My grandmother was the last person in my family who spoke Mohawk fluently, and we all took it for granted, which is a shame, right? But I can't speak so much for Fort Hall. I do know, and I've spoken to people at the Language and Culture Department, who they're all about reviving the languages. And there are online tutorials for these kind of things. Number of native speakers, elders, is diminishing quickly everywhere in Indian country. On the other hand, and I'll speak just from my own experience, I have little cousins who are, a quarter my age who speak Mohawk fluently. My uncle Bob Phillips passed away a few months ago. He was a bus driver in Kahnawake, the reserve where we're from. And he was from the bush, he spoke Mohawk. And, the bush, we're a stone's throw from the city of Montreal. But there are areas on the reserve that are, rural. And my uncle Bob, when he passed away, his granddaughter gave an entire traditional Mohawk funeral in the language. At which her mother, I happen to know, doesn't speak Mohawk. She's like me, and you learn words, but you really need to be immersed in it. So the kids in Mohawk country are becoming fluent through the Kahnawake Survival School, which was started in about 1970, about the same time I learned that Indians had gone extinct in Georgia. So language revival is an effort that tribes are taking. I know that's true. I know it's a huge challenge, but I know that some groups, I'm happy to learn that's happening in Hawaii because, it's compulsory. If you grow up in Kahnawake and you go to school and you're a kid, you're going to be immersed in your language right off the bat. It's not really an option. And, a lot of these people end up speaking French, English, and Mohawk by the time they're graduated. So.
Yeah, Hawaiian Air, last thing, you get on Hawaiian Air and they will do the welcome to blah, 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 the flight, and then they do it all in Hawaiian. It's just part of what they do over there now.
I love that. I was in Hawaii recently and I met with some people who were with this, I'll get the name.